Take a look at the money in your wallet. That piece of paper, on its own, is worth almost nothing. It can't feed you, protect you, or build anything. And yet, the US dollar controls global trade, shapes world economies, and determines the fate of entire nations. Oil is priced in it. International debt is measured in it. Wars are funded with it. Governments rise and fall depending on their strength. How did this happen? How did a simple piece of paper gain so much power? Here's the part most people never hear: the dollar was never guaranteed to survive. In fact, the US dollar has come dangerously close to complete collapse, not once, not twice, but multiple times throughout American history. There were moments when trust vanished, when inflation spiraled out of control, and when Americans themselves stopped believing in their own money. And every time the belief cracked, the entire system trembled on the verge of ruin. This isn't just the story of a currency. It's the story of how belief, an intangible human emotion, became the most powerful economic force on the planet. So why don't we hear this story more often? Because the history of money sits in a very uncomfortable place. It's not just economics, it's not just history, and it's not just politics. It's all three, tangled together in a way that makes a lot of people nervous. Talking openly about how money really works, and how fragile our collective trust in it truly is, has always made governments uneasy. There's a reason financial history is usually simplified in our textbooks. Too much detail can cause fear. Too much honesty can cause panic. And panic is the fastest way to destroy confidence in a currency. So, instead, the story gets shortened. We get clean timelines, neat explanations, and a narrative scrubbed clean of all the chaos and near failures. But real history is messy. The US dollar wasn't born strong. It wasn't immediately trusted. And it certainly wasn't always respected, either at home or abroad. In its early years, American money was mocked, rejected, and often considered worthless. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a common insult, a punchline that summed up just how little faith people had in it. Yet somehow, against all odds, this fragile system survived. And understanding how it survived tells us far more about America than any flag or monument ever could. Before the United States even had a dollar, it didn't really have money at all, at least, not in the way we understand it today. In colonial America, daily life ran on a chaotic mix of barter and borrowed currencies. Farmers traded their crops for goods. Merchants exchanged lumber for textiles. Debts were often settled with simple promises rather than paper. There was no single, trusted form of money that everyone could rely on. In some colonies, British pounds were the standard. In others, Spanish silver coins, the famous pieces of 8, were widely used. Dutch guilders, French coins, and all sorts of local tokens all mixed together in a confusing economic soup. The result was chaos. Each of the 13 colonies valued money differently. Physical coins were scarce, and counterfeits were everywhere. And because there was no central authority, no one could enforce trust or standardize value. Instead of uniting the colonies, money actually divided them. Trade between them was slow and difficult. Extending credit was a massive risk. And economic growth was constantly held back by this paralyzing uncertainty. This was the unstable foundation upon which America would soon attempt something far more dangerous, a revolution against the most powerful empire on earth. When the American Revolution began, the colonies faced an impossible problem. They needed to fight a war, but they had no real economy to support it. And war is incredibly expensive. You need weapons, supplies, food for the troops, and money to pay the soldiers. But the colonies had no gold reserves, no silver mines, and no unified currency. They were starting from nothing. So, they did the only thing they could. They printed money. The Continental Congress began issuing paper notes, what became known as continental currency, to fund the war effort. At first, people accepted it. They were filled with revolutionary fervor. They believed in the cause. They believed in the dream of independence. And that belief gave the paper its initial value. But belief alone can't support unlimited printing. As the war dragged on, Congress needed more and more money. And with each new printing, the value of every continental dollar already in circulation began to drop. People started to notice that their money was buying less and less. A loaf of bread that cost $1 last month now costs 2, then 5, then 10. This is the classic recipe for hyperinflation, and it was a terrifying experience for the young nation. The British, seeing a powerful opportunity, launched a campaign of economic warfare. They began producing massive quantities of counterfeit continentals, perfect forgeries that were almost impossible to tell from the real thing. They flooded the colonies with this fake money, deliberately trying to destroy what little confidence was left. And it worked. Trust evaporated. Soon, soldiers were refusing to accept their pay in Continentals. Farmers would rather let their crops rot in the fields than sell them for worthless paper. George Washington himself wrote desperate letters to Congress, warning that the army was on the verge of collapse, not because of British bullets, but because of a worthless currency. The revolution was being starved into submission. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a bitter reality. By the end of the war, the currency had lost over 99% of its value. It was a total failure. This first, disastrous experiment with a national currency left a deep scar on the American psyche. The Founding Fathers learned a brutal lesson: you cannot just print your way to prosperity. Money without trust is just paper. When they gathered to write the Constitution, this memory was fresh in their minds. They were determined to create a more stable financial system, one that couldn't be so easily destroyed. The Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. This was a huge step. For the first time, there would be a single, national authority in charge of the nation's currency. In 1792, Congress passed the Coinage Act, officially establishing the U.S. dollar as the country's standard unit of currency. But they made a crucial decision. This new dollar wouldn't be just paper. It would be backed by precious metal. The system they created was called bimetallism. This meant the value of the dollar was legally defined by a specific amount of both silver and gold. Anyone could bring their gold or silver to the newly created U.S. Mint and have it turned into official American coins, free of charge. The idea was to anchor the currency to something real, something tangible, to prevent the government from simply printing money into oblivion as they had with the Continental. This new, metal-backed dollar was a massive improvement. It was more stable, more trusted, and it helped unify the national economy. But it was far from perfect. The problem with tying your currency to two different metals is that the market value of gold and silver is always changing. If the price of gold goes up relative to silver, people will hoard their gold coins and only spend the less valuable silver ones. This is known as Gresham's Law: bad money drives out good. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. struggled with this delicate balancing act. The country lurched between periods where gold was dominant and periods where silver was, causing constant economic instability. This debate over gold versus silver became one of the most passionate and divisive political issues of the era. It wasn't just an economic argument, it was a cultural war. On one side were the gold bugs, mostly bankers, industrialists, and creditors from the Northeast. They wanted a currency based purely on gold, which they saw as stable, secure, and honest. On the other side were the Silverites, primarily farmers, miners, and debtors from the West and South. They wanted the government to coin more silver, which would increase the money supply, cause a little inflation, and make it easier for them to pay back their debts. This conflict came to a head in the presidential election of 1896, with William Jennings Bryan famously declaring, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Ultimately, the gold bugs won. In 1900, the U.S. officially adopted the gold standard. The dollar was now defined solely by a fixed amount of gold. For a while, it seemed like the problem was solved. The gold standard provided a sense of stability and predictability that had been missing for over a century. The American economy boomed. But this golden age of stability was about to run headfirst into the greatest economic catastrophe in modern history, the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it triggered a global chain reaction. Panicked investors and ordinary citizens rushed to the banks to pull out their money. But they didn't just want paper dollars, they wanted gold, the one thing everyone still trusted. The U.S. government was legally obligated to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. As more and more people cashed in their dollars, the nation's gold reserves began to drain away at an alarming speed. The government faced an impossible choice. They could either print more money to help the collapsing banks and stimulate the economy, but that would break their promise to back every dollar with gold. Or, they could stick to the gold standard, which meant keeping the money supply tight, even as the economy suffocated and unemployment skyrocketed. For a few painful years, they chose the latter, and the Depression only got worse. Then, in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made one of the most radical and controversial decisions in American financial history. To stop the drain on the nation's gold, he effectively took the United States off the gold standard for its own citizens. It became illegal for Americans to own most forms of gold bullion. They were ordered to turn in their gold to the government in exchange for paper dollars. This was a seismic shift. The direct link between the dollar you held in your hand and a physical piece of gold was broken. From that point on, the value of the dollar inside the U.S. became a matter of government policy and public faith, exactly the kind of system the Founding Fathers had feared. But the story doesn't end there. While Americans could no longer trade their dollars for gold, foreign governments still could. This created a new international system after World War II, known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. The U.S. dollar, still backed by gold for international transactions, became the world's official reserve currency. Other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. For about 25 years, this system brought incredible stability and prosperity. The U.S. sat at the center of the global financial universe. But by the late 1960s, history began to repeat itself. The U.S. was spending massive amounts of money on the Vietnam War and domestic social programs. It was printing more dollars than it could realistically back with its gold reserves. Other countries, especially France, saw the writing on the wall. They began to doubt America's ability to honor its promise and started trading in their dollars for U.S. gold. Once again, America's gold was flowing out of the country. The situation came to a head in the summer of 1971. President Richard Nixon faced the same dilemma as FDR. He could either impose brutal economic austerity to protect the gold standard or he could abandon it entirely. On a Sunday night in August, he went on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold for anyone. This event, known as the Nixon Shock, officially and permanently severed the dollar's last link to gold. For the first time in history, the world's most important currency was backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. It was a pure fiat currency. Many experts predicted disaster. They believed that without the discipline of gold, the dollar would collapse under the weight of runaway inflation. And for a while, it looked like they might be right. The 1970s were a decade of brutal stagflation, high unemployment combined with soaring prices. Confidence in the dollar, and in America itself, plummeted. But then, something remarkable happened. The dollar didn't collapse. Instead, a new system quietly emerged to take the place of gold. This new system was built on a different kind of commodity, one even more essential to the modern world: oil. Through a series of agreements made in the mid-1970s, the U.S. secured a deal with Saudi Arabia and other major oil-producing nations. They would price their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and it was a stroke of geopolitical and economic genius. Since every country needs to buy oil, every country now needs to acquire U.S. dollars to pay for it. This created a constant, global demand for American currency that had nothing to do with gold. It effectively made the dollar the mandatory currency for the world's most important commodity. This propped up the dollar's value and cemented its role as the world's primary reserve currency, a position it still holds today. So, when you look at that dollar bill now, you're not just looking at a piece of paper. You're looking at a history of revolution, of civil war, of political battles between gold and silver. You're seeing the ghost of the Great Depression, the legacy of 2 world wars, and the quiet power of the petrodollar system. The dollar's value is no longer based solely on metal in a vault. It's built on a complex web of history, military power, political alliances, and, most importantly, the simple, unspoken belief of millions of people around the world that tomorrow, it will still be worth something. That is the untold story of the dollar, a story of how pure belief was forged into global power. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button for more videos.